Today, we're diving into the transformative power of yoga for the vagina with Tamra Mercieca, a woman's health expert who turned her own journey of healing, both physically and emotionally, into a powerful practice for birth and beyond. We'll explore how releasing fear, connecting with your pelvis, and using words and mantras can create real physical changes, making birth a more easeful and empowering experience. Plus, we'll discuss how parenting can be a mirror for deep personal growth. If you're ready to shift your mindset around birth, body, and self-love, this episode is for you. Hi, I'm Debra Pascali-Bonaro, founder and director of Orgasmic Birth and host of the Orgasmic Birth podcast. I am so honored to have my guest, Tamra Mercieca, here, who's been working for 20 plus years as a self-love therapist, author and women's pelvic health guide, podcast host of I Love Me with Tamra Mercieca, and founder of Getting Naked online school, teaching women how to fall in love with themselves. She enjoys reading, nature, play, dancing, and traveling with her little family. And Tamra, I'm such a fan of yours. I have to tell everybody, I actually took your Yoga for Vagina class years back. You remember we
Awesome.
spoke about it, and I
Yeah.
so appreciated that gift. And I've been following your work and your podcasts, and it's really had an impact on me. So I'm so honored that you're joining us today to share a bit more of your own story and share your wisdom with our audience.
Well, thank you, because I first heard about you when I read Orgasmic Birth. And so that was like my opening into, okay, birth doesn't have to be so scary.
Well, thank you. And that's a good segue too, because I'd love to hear about your own journey with birth and then how that impacted and brought you to all that you're doing today.
Sure. So I'll share the birth story, I suppose. So it was 2 weeks past my official due date. And I was sitting on the couch. We'd just gone for a walk. It was in the evening, and I felt this sort of sensation in my belly. And it's like, oh, I feel like I need to poo out of my belly. And I'm like, could that be a contraction? And my husband's like, well, maybe. And then a couple of minutes, I had another one. And I'm like, okay, so maybe I'll go brush my teeth. And by the time I brushed my teeth, I'd had about another 4. And so we texted our birth team because we were planning a home birth. And I'm like, oh, I've had 6 contractions in the last, 20 minutes. We'll go to sleep and I'll let you know how we're doing in the morning. Within half an hour of everything starting, it got really, really intense. And I was just like, whoa, this is like back to back within a minute and a half between contractions. And we're like, well, should we call the midwife? We don't want to, waste her time. I know. So my husband calls and she's like, put me onto Tamra. And she's like, I'm coming straight over. And so she came over, and within the first hour, so she did a check just to see where I was at. And I was 8 centimeters dilated. So it was like, okay, what I thought was, because originally I was like, oh my gosh, if this is like pre-labor, I can't do active labor. This is way too much. And I was already in active labor. So then we called our doula, and she rushed over, and then they're trying to get the birth pool filled. And so eventually they got that filled, and then eventually I hopped in. And it was very intense. I mean, it wasn't an orgasmic birth. I think there was, because the contractions were just so back to back, I'd learned it's in between the contractions that you do all these beautiful things, massage and watch your wedding video and have all music going. There was no time for any of that. So yeah, I was in the pool, and it got to the point where I was like, I don't know if I can handle this anymore. And I've reached down, I could feel my son's head at my vagina. And I'm like, where's my transition? Because I'd, learned there's a transition. You get half an hour where you rest, baby turns.
Right.
And it's exactly. And it's like, okay, there's no transition happening today. And so then I'm trying to get him out, and it just felt too much. And then I had this internal feeling, just lift a leg. So I'd been on all fours and So I lifted a leg, and on the next contraction, he just flew all out, all in one go, still in his sack. So I stooped down
Wow.
and picked him up. Yeah. And then that was my moment of like, oh, wow. Like, and I'm not even going to try and put words on the feeling. It was just expansive love that I can't even express. So that was my birth
Wow.
experience.
Thank you for sharing. And you're an example. Like sometimes people say to me they wish for a really quick labor. And I always say, be careful what you wish
No.
for, because it can be a wild ride when it's so intense like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And there was, when I reflected on it, because I think everything that happens in life is teaching us something about how we do life and what we can learn. And it's like up until that point, my life had been very much be really productive, get a lot done in not too much time, but not necessarily enjoy the pleasure of it. And that was kind of the birth experience. So that taught me a lot. And since then, I've slowed down a lot and I'm much more present and I can enjoy the pleasure of life. So big learning.
Yeah. And I like how you say that because birth has so many lessons for us, right? So good to hear that, even though it was quite intense, there was a lot to come out of it. And I also have to just like say, babies born in the sack, we say is born in the caul. They're always said to be very special. Many cultures, right, really say that they have an extra gift. So I'm wondering if you're noticing that from your child.
Yes, I mean, every mother thinks their child is beautiful. So, I don't want to dismiss that. But yeah, he's the kindest, most generous little cute, funny being, and he's academically about 6 years ahead of what he's meant to be. So that's been a journey.
Thank you for
That's a whole
sharing
podcast
that.
episode in itself.
Ah, well,
Mm.
I know kind of that you talked about overcoming fears, right? And when everyone today is leading up to birth, they often have some fears in that. And can you talk about that a little bit, what that process was like for you and how you educated yourself to get ready to feel more confident for birth?
Absolutely. So fear, essentially, when we go into fear, the body contracts. And when we continue to have those contractions, it creates tension patterns in the body. And that can be throughout the whole body, but in our pelvic floor, that's essentially where we hold a lot of our contractions. There's even studies that show that women who experience anxiety often have a tight, tense pelvic floor. So there's a strong correlation between that. And then if the pelvic floor is 16 muscles that are woven into three different layers. And if we're holding tension in there or there's tension in particular muscles, it's creating imbalances in the pelvic floor. And then we can start to experience all sorts of issues like incontinence and lower back pain and just instability in the body. But when it comes to birthing, if you're holding a lot of tension in the pelvic floor, it's kind of like you're trying to get a baby through a brick wall. So that pelvic floor, it needs to be able to relax and release and let go so then that the baby can move on through. And so in my experience, um, when women have really long births, it's because they're holding a lot of tension in their pelvic floor, which is a result of holding a lot of fears that have then turned into these tension patterns. And so when they're going through the birth process, it's like they have to release all those fears in order for the tension to unwind so then that they can let the baby out. So when I was coming into thinking about I might want to have a baby, my biggest fear in life, like hugest fear ever, was giving birth. And I went, okay, well, I need to look at that before I even consider getting pregnant. And so one of the books that I read was yours, Orgasmic Birth. And I read a heap of different books. And then I was doing my yoga for the vagina practice, which was helping release tension and get me connected to my pelvis. And then I did a 10-day retreat. It was a teacher training for yoga, but it was focused on pregnancy and giving birth. And so on this retreat, we were learning all the different things that can happen during birth and what to do in the cases if it's a breech or how you can turn the baby around, how to, I suppose, avoid having interventions if you're in a hospital setting, so then that you can have a natural birth. And that I felt really empowered me to be able to release some of those fears and go, oh, actually, if there are situations where it might lead to an intervention, there's actually alternatives. There's something that I can do to help support that. And one example that actually happened to me is because I went past my due date, which actually is very normal. Is that I went in, I had to go in the hospital and, do the ultrasound, check the heartbeat just to check everything was okay. And they said, oh, there's not enough amniotic fluid and we're going to have to induce. And so I've called my private midwife and she's like, drink a heap of water before your next ultrasound. So here I am
Yes.
downing like 2 liters of water. And then I went to the next ultrasound and like, oh, it's all fine. And it's like, it's these little things that we don't know that can lead to interventions and the baby, the birth being disrupted if we don't have that information. So I feel that like getting education, like the training that I did or the books that I read, I also, when I got pregnant, I did your Pain to Power, I think it was, course, just
Yes.
to make sure I had heaps and heaps of information so I knew that everything was okay. So I think educating yourself is a huge part of relieving those fears so that we're not holding those tension patterns in the body. And like I mentioned, I was doing my yoga for the vagina practice. So this is a practice I created about 15 years ago. And this practice, there's a focus of pelvic activation so that you're building tone in the pelvis, absolutely, because we want to have that suppleness. But the big focus is on releasing tension. Because if we try and build tone in the pelvic floor, in the whole pelvis, and you're already tense, then you're building tension upon tension, which leads to a weak pelvic floor. And so we focus on releasing all of that tension. And as a result of doing this, because it's such an intimate practice, we're helping to release our fears. And so there's layers of traumas. And, if a woman has been sexually abused, which is like 1 in 3 women. So if a woman has gone through that experience or just had sex that she wasn't happy about or didn't feel right, she's able to start to let go of all of that stuff that she's been holding on to, so that when it does come to giving birth, she's not holding on to all of that tension.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that because a lot of people are like, yoga for the vagina. Can you give any examples of that? How can people start getting in touch with that pelvic floor?
One simple way is just to lay on the floor. I like to lay with my head slightly raised, and then put your feet flat on the floor with your knees pointing towards the ceiling. I call it base position in yoga for the vagina, but it's also known as semi-supine or constructive rest pose, because in that position, your body naturally starts to release tension without you needing to do anything. This is a posture that is taught in Alexander technique, which is a releasing tension technique. I've done a lot of training in that, so that's very much woven into my practices. So we get in that position, so the body's starting to release, and then maybe just like cup your vulva and start to breathe into it, inviting your whole vagina and your whole pelvis to let go on the exhalations. And the more you start to do that, the more you start to connect in with your pelvis. And that's something that we can all do, 5-10 minutes. You can start to really get a bit of a sense of what's going on in there, because most of us are very disconnected from our pelvis. We hold a lot of shame around anything sexual related, pleasure related. It's just ingrained in our society, so much societal conditioning. So just starting to reconnect in that simple way can be really powerful.
Yeah. Thank you, Tamra. And your program it really was fantastic for me. So for people that are listening, and you'll tell them more about it at the end too, because
Sure.
I agree with you. We're not connecting to our bodies enough. And as you said, really addressing the fears and the tensions that are building up over years, right? And layering as we, are approaching birth. So important. But I know you have so much wisdom and you talk a lot about words and mantras and feelings that to also create that physical change in the body and support us in pregnancy and birth. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so what we focus on, I believe we create, or we have a bigger chance of creating in our reality. And in that way, we can use words, intentions, mantras to help get a feeling in the body that sort of makes us magnetic to attracting in what we want to experience. So when I was pregnant with my son, I had this little mantra that I'd say to him every day. And I can't remember the exact words, but it was something like this: head down, your spine against my belly, cord away from your body, and I love you.
Aw, that's beautiful. Say that one
Yeah.
more time because that was so sweet.
So head down, your spine against my belly, cord away from your body, and I love you. And the interesting thing was, he had a really long umbilical cord. And I've heard so many horror stories of the cord getting wrapped around the baby's neck or around the body, and that then needing to be intervened with in birth. So I was very grateful that that didn't actually eventuate. And he was head down at 36 weeks. He was totally in position, which made me think he was coming early. No, no.
Yeah, but he listened to that. He listened to your thought suggestions, right? And what a beautiful kind of way of connecting with him in utero and just preparing for birth.
Yeah, and it was interesting because I remember when I was pregnant, I didn't feel connected to him at all. I just couldn't get connected. So it was just my little way of trying to create a connection or trying to communicate with him. And I'd read to him, but I didn't feel, I expected to feel something with him inside me. And it wasn't until he came out, that moment where I scooped him out of the water, that I went, whoa, okay, I'm connected. I feel. So I suppose I just want to say to other mums, if they are not feeling connected during pregnancy, don't worry about it.
And I love the idea that people create something meaningful, right? Ways that they can bring those affirmations and mantras to themselves in a personal way.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, and I should probably mention that I also, when I was setting up my birth space, had a heap of positive mantras, pinned to the wall to help me through the birthing process. I didn't get a chance to look at many of them because it was so quick. But when things got really hard, I really held on to, I'm about to meet my baby. I'm about to meet my baby. I'm about to meet my baby. And that was kind of what carried me through each of the really intense contractions.
Beautiful. So I know that you've had your own journey with kind of self-love and getting into that place. Would you want to talk a bit about that journey
Oh, there's
and
been so many
how
journeys.
others? What? Yeah.
There's been so many journeys. I mean, it all started. I grew up in a home that my mum was emotionally and often physically abusive. So by the time I hit my, teens, I was had a very low self-esteem. I was being bullied. I had a very bad, severe acne. And then by the time I was in my early 20s, I was diagnosed as being having severe clinical depression and put on antidepressants. And then it got to the point that I'd become a risk to myself. I was trying to commit suicide every other weekend, and I was told I needed to be put in a mental home. So that was kind of like my big wake up call, like, whoa, this is not the way that I want my future to go. And so I made a very clear commitment and decision that day that I was going to do whatever it took to overcome depression. And over the next couple of years, I learned various techniques that completely cleared out the depression and helped me have a very healthy self-talk and helped me feel good about myself, get me off my meds. And then that's kind of what laid the foundation for me to go ahead and create a 10-session program where I now get people depression and pill free. So that was kind of the inward journey of how it happened, and probably why I also waited till I was 37 to have a baby, because I wanted to make sure that I was so solid in myself that I could be there fully for a child and I wasn't going to mess them up.
But thank you for sharing that journey because I know for many listeners, right? We all have different stories and potential traumas or depressions and that. And your work is amazing how you took that time and how self-love became such a part of it. And you've brought that in to your practice, to your birth. And I know that now, and we often say that, we're connected to the generations before us and in front of us. And when we can heal things from that past, we do it for ourselves, but we do it for our children and future generations. And you talk about parenting, let your child be the mirror for healing and reflection and personal growth. Can you talk about that? Because you've done this healing and now you
Mm.
have this new journey.
So when my husband and I finally decided, okay, we think it's time to have a baby, it was sort of from the space of, well, we feel like we've gone as far as we can with our learnings. Not that you ever go as far as you can with your learnings, but we felt like we're in a very good place. And we're like, okay, let's have a baby. And then that baby's just going to reflect whatever else that we need to look at right back at us. So then that we can continue our deep healing journey. So we went into having a baby with that intention. And so when my son was born, when I just looked at his behavior and every time I noticed his behavior, it was like, okay, there's something that I don't think is healthy. Where am I doing that? Where have I got that going on? And then I would do my internal healing, and then that would naturally, his behavior would change. So an example early on was when I first had him, every time I went to pick him up from the change table, I noticed that there was like this look of fear on his face as if he was scared of me picking him up. And I was like, oh my gosh, my baby's scared of me picking him up. And then I went, oh, I'm scared of picking him up. I'm so scared of breaking my fragile little baby. And so I did some healing work around that. And as soon as I did, there was no fear reflected from him. So that's kind of an example of how this mirror reflection works. So I'm a big believer that life is our mirror reflection. And whenever we get triggered or whenever we have someone treat us in a way that's a bit unsavory, and if that arises emotion within us, it's showing us what we need to look at. And if we're willing to do inner healing around that, then the external situation changes. And so that's very much how I've approached my parenting, is that if there is some interesting behavior going on, where am I doing that? And I see that with my clients. I have a client, because I work with adults, but with their childhood conditioning. And they might say to me, oh, my child's really anxious. And I'm like, well, are you anxious? They're like, oh, yeah, I'm so anxious. I'm like, so you heal your anxiety, and then your child is not going to experience anxiety because they're just a product of their environment. So we, as children, from conception up until age 7, we are just absorbing and taking on the stuff of the big people around us. We notice how they act, how they behave, their energy, the decisions they make. We are taking all of that on, and that essentially forms our programming or our blueprint for life and how we do life. So if we can, as parents, look to our children and see them as the wise ones, just being this mirror reflection, letting us know what we need to look at, then that is such a profound healing journey that we can go on. And it also offers the child the best possible chance of having a healthy self-esteem and solid self-love.
What a beautiful way to look at it. I really have to say, Tamra, that was just so touching. I'm sure for everyone listening too, giving you really a moment to reflect. So I'd love to ask, for those that are listening that are pregnant or thinking about being pregnant, you've given us lots of tips, but is there one more thing you'd want to say to someone that's preparing and wanting to have a more pleasurable birth? What else would you suggest?
Work on yourself. Get your self-love as high as you can. However you do that. I've got a podcast where I share tools and tips and techniques. Whatever it is, read books. Just try and focus on getting you all loved up, because then you're going to get triggered less when you have a child. And you're going to trust yourself more. So one of the things when we're going through birth is we want to be able to trust our body and trust that we've got this. And I think having that self-belief and that self-love is a huge part of that.
Beautiful advice. Thank you so much. And I know people probably really want to know how they can reach you, a little bit about your programs and that. Can you share?
Sure. So, the easiest way is I have a podcast called I Love Me with Tamra Mercieca. I share weekly tips, tools, and practices to help grow your self-love. There is a lot around women's pelvic health in there as well. If you want to dive deeper than that, I have an online school called Getting Naked. You can check it out at gettingnaked.com.au. And the idea is that we strip off the layers of childhood conditioning so that you can fall in love with yourself. So, really big on mental health. There's also the pelvic health program, which is yoga for the vagina. This is for women specifically. And the idea is to educate you on how to look after your feminine body through the different cycles, through the different phases, and give you practices that help awaken the pelvis so that you can feel more pleasure, but also so then that you can release that tension so you can activate healing within the body. So, yeah, there's a heap of different programs on my website. Feel free to check it out. Yeah.
Thank you, Tamra. And we will put all that in the show notes. So wherever you're listening today, definitely check below and check out Tamra's offerings. As I said, I actually was a part of Yoga for the Vagina and highly recommend it. So
Thank
I
you.
thank you again for joining us and sharing your birth story and all your wisdom.
Thank you very much.
And to everyone, thank you for coming along. We'd love to hear from you. What are you taking away? We always appreciate your comments and feedbacks, and we really appreciate it if you'd rate and review our podcast and share it with friends and colleagues so we can reach more people with this great wisdom of how to bring more pleasure to our birth and life. Thank you.